University of Singapore to take it away.
Thank you very much, Jenny. And you didn't tell me we would be competing with cake, but feel free to grab cake, come back. So for the last day and a half, we've been talking about various forms of trying to make AI helpful, not harmful. I think the last panel was a little bit more optimistic than some of our discussion on Thursday, where we spent some amount of time talking about alignment in the kind of grand sense of trying to prevent AI rising up to kill us all. This panel, we moved to a more nuanced question of alignment, cultural alignment, and in particular looking at low-resource languages. In many ways, we build on the presentation yesterday by Stephen Bird, who talked about the challenges and opportunities, perhaps, of the role that AI can play in preserving or engaging with Indigenous languages in Australia in particular. We'll broaden that canvas to talk about low-resource languages more generally. In the context of thinking about AI equity, which brings up what was talked about in the last panel, and the reference to the Global South in particular, we tend to focus, as a number of people have mentioned, fundamental resource constraints like access to power, the couple of 750 million or so people who don't have stable electricity, access to the internet, a couple of billion people don't have stable access to the internet, and so on. But there is a different kind of problem that is not just access to those resources or compute, talent and so on, but data. And there are many data-poor countries in the world, or environments in the world, where you don't have even the fundamental building blocks of AI systems. So in the description for the panel, we came up with 4 questions, each of which could launch a conference in its own right. How do we measure and mitigate cultural bias in large language models, especially when benchmarks fail to capture nuance? And that was, I think, something that really came through in Stephen's presentation yesterday. What are the most effective ways to support low-resource languages while balancing global performance against cultural sensitivity? Who should own and govern the data and models for underrepresented communities, and how can local voices be brought into the development process? And looking forward, should the aim be universal multilingual systems or a federation of culturally aligned models? So 4 questions, as I said, each of which could launch a conference, but we've got 5 panelists, so I'm sure we'll solve all of them. In the interest of time, I'm going to very briefly introduce people and then start with a series of questions, trying to leave time for all of you to get involved. So going your left to right, Chunhua is a postdoctoral researcher in software engineering at University of Melbourne, where she focuses on enhancing large language models for automated code review. Orlowski at AI Singapore is a specialist in emerging technologies and their societal impacts, with a PhD in sociocultural anthropology, where he stalked various transhumanists around Sweden for a couple of years. Frermann is a lecturer in the School of Computing and Information Systems at University of Melbourne, focusing on natural language processing. Zhuang is a lecturer at RMIT with research expertise in natural language processing, also machine learning and data-efficient AI. And Hakim Norhashim is another colleague of mine at AI Singapore, where his work centers on AI governance and alignment, and for his sins has spent more time than I think anyone should trying to get large language models to be racist, among other things, which he might touch on. So I thought we would start large, and Eric, I'll start with you as our resident, probably the only anthropologist in the room, I'm guessing. Yeah. Famously a discipline that is focused on deep, very specific examination of cultures rather than just modeling them through computer simulation. And so you've emphasized in the past that culture is too complex to quote-unquote vibe code, and that meaningful alignment requires conceptual clarity from the start. So in your view, what does cultural alignment mean in practice, and why is defining it so important?
Sure, and I mean, I think we can start with, of course, a sort of relatively straightforward definition, which are always the most complex ones to kind of eventually work with. But I think cultural alignment in practice really looks at trying to ensure that AI systems as sort of tools, systems, technologies, however we kind of want to frame that, are fundamentally culturally permissible, which is a very, very broad definition in some ways, but it runs the gamut from the stuff that Stephen Bird yesterday was talking about in this sort of like the code design and making sure that they're actually deployed and used in ways that sort of make sense, in this case, within the context of First Peoples here in Australia. But then it runs the gamut to make sure that, say, the output of large language models use the same, you know, the right kind of phrasing. It can be something like if you speak to a chatbot from your local government, you expect it to speak to you in a certain tone, with a certain set of language. So it's a very broad sort of idea or set of ideas that we're talking about, right? When we think of cultural alignment, it's both kind of external to the systems, but also within the systems themselves. So when it then comes to thinking about this with a sense of conceptual clarity, I think the broadness of cultural alignment as an area of work kind of translates or reflects itself in the idea that culture conceptually is around about as broad. I mean, I think there's a book from 1952 or 54 where two anthropologists outline something like 300 definitions of culture. And I mean, that's the sort of stuff that people in my discipline and adjacent ones have been trying to unpick for the past 100 years. Because the real challenge when we think about culture is that it's not just sort of you and I think most people in this room can kind of intuit what we talk about when we mean culture, but really try to codify it in a sort of grounded way becomes very difficult, because we're talking suddenly about, values and beliefs and rituals, but also food and identity and everything else, right? So like everything around us is culturally encoded. We are deeply culturally encoded. So how do you think about operationalizing this sort of, this kind of thinking and this kind of work when everything is potentially cultural data, when everything is in some way cultural, whether we kind of like it or not? So I think having this sort of conceptual clarity is less about, I think, speaking of culture as such, culture writ large, and I think more thinking about what the social sciences actually tend to do in practice, which is focusing much more on cultural context. So thinking about who is using it, why is it being used, does it make sense for them to use it this way, are they involved, how has the data been gathered, is the data sort of, does it make sense to use, is it sort of high quality and so on, right? And I think all of these questions become burningly important when we really need to start operationalizing this stuff, move it away from the sort of theorizing that us anthropologists have been doing for the past 120, 150 years, and really begin to not only bring it into practice, but also try to kind of connect it cross-disciplinarily into things like data science and computer science and engineering and so on.
Yeah, so thanks. I think you've really helpfully highlighted two things that I think we'll come back to through this panel. One is, what exactly we're talking about.
Yes.
And that the problem with culture and AI is both terms have very loose boundaries. But also the methodological challenge of, and this is something we've sort of grappled with in AI Singapore, is bringing social sciences and natural science and the hard sciences, as they like to call themselves, together when in practice, as you operationalize this, you need kind of yes/no answers. And Chunhua, that brings me directly to you, because one of the interesting things in your work is that you've shown that sometimes cultural bias is not necessarily good or bad. It can be appropriate or misaligned depending on who the user is. So how do you think about cultural bias in your work and how to measure it in ways that capture this nuance rather than treating it, as Eric was kind of also pushing back, as a kind of binary yes/no, which is what the computer scientists tend to prefer working with?
Sure. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Eric. I really want to, so I'm a research fellow in natural language processing, so I work with computers, data, but I really like to talk to cultural anthropic people, understand how the cultural framework in that domain, and I think it's really important. So from my personal point of view, I think how I interpret cultural bias is, if we think about people, cultural bias, it's like for a person, they tend to perceive or they tend to judge a situation from their own cultural perspective. So if we think from language models, it's the same thing. So human beings, we grow up in an environment, we acquire our cultural way of doing things like that. And we need that kind of cultural bias to help us to navigate around the world, around our environment. And for language models, they were pre-trained on large amount of internet data, and they are clearly very English heavy, English dominated, and the values, the culture embedded them are actually being transferred into the model. So that's, for language models, how does cultural bias look like? It's the same. So when you ask a question, the model tends to respond in a way that it's trained on. So think about what's the most likely tokens to come out. So that's how cultural bias is like inside the model. So when we think about actually how do we want to measure cultural bias, I think one thing important is that we need a clear definition and like framework to defining what kind of levels cultural bias are we evaluating? Is it country level, is it state level, or is it community level? So within each of the level, the required underlying cultural signals or data or configurations will be very different. And so that's point one. We need a multi-leveled, multifaceted kind of framework to help us to clearly define which part are we actually working at. That's point one. Point two is we need to make sure that what we are evaluating actually reached a cultural consensus by people from that culture. Or we need a reliable estimation to make sure that what we are measuring is actually somehow being agreed by people from that culture. So one example is I'm looking at those kind of nationwide, nationwise value survey questions. One of them is called World Value Survey. So they ask people questions like, how much do you believe in God? Yes or no? They do this kind of collections response from, like, for example, people from US. They ask thousands of people from US, and then you can get our estimation of like 80% people saying yes, 20% people saying no. So this is a good kind of estimation, reliable. But in another example, I ran into them in a recent data set, which is asking, what's your favorite childhood snack food? So the one answer to the Mandarin one is cheese stick. So it's like, no, that's not what I had when I was a kid. So I won't agree if there's only one answer towards that, and if the model is only being asked to answer in one way. But if you say, people from the north part, and 20% of them had this kind of cheese stick as their childhood favorite food, I would say, okay, let's accept. So that's about second one, reaching the cultural consensus. The third one, I think it's about culture itself. It's not just about text. So we work in NLP, we focus text a lot, but culture itself is also about vision. What do we see, what do you hear, and how do we interpret them? So how can we collect, I mean, in the end, from our perspective, we do need some kind of measurement from data. So we need the benchmarks actually to be able to reveal this kind of cultural bias inside to measure. And I'll answer briefly for the third one, how can we actually mitigate the cultural bias inside? Two perspectives, one from a more technical perspective. So we do need actual cultural data, data that's reflecting cultural needs and cultural signals that allow us to steer the model towards that we want to, and that's point one. And also, we need to develop more efficient ways of training models so that the model doesn't need too much amount of data to be able to learn the cultural signals inside. Yeah, so we are exploring with Kabir from MDAP and also Suka from Monash, we are exploring whether like cultural associative data can reveal like cultural signals and being used as like cognitively grounded way to do that. From the second, more broader perspective, I think it's also echoing what Stephen Bird was talking yesterday. So I do think we need a unified, for low resource language, I think we need a unified community of like researcher and industries and also users. So we need to follow like a loop so that researchers can develop tools for local communities and low resource one for them to use, and researcher can conceptualize industries if they can implement, make it more scalable, and for user from that culture, they can provide positive feedback. So one of the NLP called Rafa, so he's developed like T2, which is a low resource language machine translation tool, and people are using it and providing feedback in what's good, what's bad, and so yeah, so that's. Yeah,
so I mean, again, you raise really interesting questions, among others, about what the aim should be here. And at what level we should be aiming, if we're aiming for cultural alignment. Because I understood Stephen Bird to be saying that this is not necessarily an answerable question, that there might be a process rather than an outcome, but in the kind of coding community, it's sometimes suggested, okay, well, the easiest thing to do is model it at the level of nation. But nations are complex, or states are complex. Against that, you've got the tendency of these large language models, as I think most of us are familiar with, towards sycophancy. And so the other extreme could be it can be coded to your individual preferences rather than as being a part of a cultural community. Okay, so questions we'll probably come back to. Zhuang, if I can turn to you, your research is focused on culturally inclusive natural language processing and pluralistic alignment frameworks. So what does cultural alignment mean to you in operational terms, and whose voices should shape the values that we embed in these models?
Yes, thanks. Is it working? Yeah, I think that's a very good question. For me, I think cultural alignment is a technique to make the large language model to adhere to human values. But actually, human value is a very broad term from my perspective because it's quite diverse. So for me, I think there are multiple levels for the cultural alignment. In the first level, we have to ensure the large language model respect to the basic universal principles like respect human rights and not output discrimination or harassment or not encouraging the suicide. That's the basic level. And we call it that LLM safety. That's actually the most currently research is focused on. But I think on top of that, we have to have another levels. In many cases, actually the large language model responses should be culturally dependent. For example, for the question, if you are with a family and in one's house, and if they invited you to have food, but now there's not a single answer, right? Because the human values are diverse. You cannot just simply say yes or no. Actually, it's culturally dependent. If the family is a Western family in the Western context, actually it's very polite just to refuse if you feel full. But if you are with an Asian family, for example, Chinese or Indian, then rejecting food directly might not be polite. So usually in this case, you might have to have a little taste. Even if you feel really full, you need to have a little bit of taste. But that, so in this case area, if the large language model knows the cultural context, it can respond given the cultural context. But in many cases, because we communicate with large language model only with text input, sometimes maybe with the other modalities like speech or images. But in most cases, the large language model lacks the cultural context. So in this case, actually, we can see there are conflicting values. Like you can say yes, you can say no, that both are okay. But I think in this case, the large language model should reflect the spectrum of viewpoints transparently. It can say that in the Western, it has to mention both situations. In the Western context, you could just reject politely, but in the Asian context, you might have a little bit taste. It has to mention both situations transparently. And I think that's the level 2, I think. But still, there's another level. If the larger model lacks the knowledge about specific cultures, because there are some minority cultures or low resource languages. For example, one language I was studying, I was just out of curiosity. It's just is called Yani. It's the First Nation language of Australia in the North Territory. I just studied simply for interest. But I input several questions related to that culture to ChatGPT. I found that ChatGPT just output garbage because it doesn't know anything about that language, even a single character. And in that case, I think the ChatGPT should be transparent that it doesn't know anything about this culture and should lead the users to some trusted sources to learn about that culture. But unfortunately, I think in given current research, the large language model cannot achieve the level, from my perspective, from level 2 to level 4. It only stays in the level 1 to make it safe. And even for making it safe, sometimes it has bias. Because I was involved, I'm a very technical person. I'm involved in several large language model projects. For one project I'm involved, there's no any guardrails, there's no any safety alignment at all. So even at the level 1, they don't have any process. But for another project I'm involved, they do use the safety alignment firstly by defining several principles, several rules. But the principles are not defined by social scientists. It's actually defined by a group of engineers. They define several hundreds of rules, and then they send the rules to their leader. And their leader would just skim all the rules and select finally, I think it's 29. So actually, because the larger model will have a lot of users, and later the value of the model becomes the value of the leader of the developers. I think, I'm not sure how OpenAI solved this problem, but I read several blogs. They only wrote blogs now, and they have, I think they only have less than 20 rules from that blog they wrote. So imagine, I think maybe Sam Altman just read all defined all the rules, maybe. But if that's the case, I think that's horrible, because given my current observation, not only adults or the children, there's now a crisis for us teachers. The children rarely come to the class because they think they could use ChatGPT to self-educate. And in the meantime, I think the children's value may also be influenced by ChatGPT. And actually, it turns out if the ChatGPT's value is just the Sam Altman's value, and it's not diverse, doesn't reflect the viewpoints from different cultural background, then what would the world would be for the next generation?
Well, it could be worse. They could be using Grok.
yeah. Then that reflects Elon Musk's value.
So again, I mean, you again raised really interesting questions. And actually, both you and Chunhua have highlighted, for humans, visual cues are enormously important. Like in the culturally ambiguous context you're mentioning, like if it's like, should I eat the food or not, you can read people's expression and sort of moderate your engagement. But against that, I'm also, I'm recalling there are studies of how bad humans are at telling when other humans are lying. And actually most humans are better at telling if someone's lying if you can't see them, because you have all sorts of false signals. But maybe an example more like what you're describing is, I'm of a generation that still gets furious with the way students will write emails with no capitals, no irregular grammar, very informal, because of different and they don't get any of those visual signals they would if they were speaking to me in person. So we've got that kind of question, but even at the level of cultural difference, I mean, you were highlighting the real challenge of a very, very low resource language that the large language model has no experience of. But even in big cultures, like famously the distinction between Americans and the British, among the other examples, if a British person says that's quite good, the American hears it meaning, oh, that's very good. But the British person means that's terrible. So we've got all these sort of fine-grained distinctions that I think are really hard, even for humans to pass, let alone to reduce to rules. And most of us would struggle, I think, to write down our cultural principles.
Yeah.
It's a bit, I mean, Laura is familiar with this. I mean, there's a famous old line about pornography, very hard to define, but I know it when I see it. And so I think one of the challenges here is whether the aim is to have rules for culture as opposed to processes. And maybe this gets back to what Stuart Russell said about his own view of alignment was not to tell the machine to do what we want, but a version of tell the machine what we would ask it to do if we thought about it really carefully and were doing the right thing, because we struggle to even give instructions. So Hakim, let me turn to you, because you, as I mentioned, have been involved in the kind of operational side of this, and you've sort of pointed out how cultural alignment becomes actionable only when we identify the right levers. From technical interventions to user experience design to socio-technical integration. Can you talk through, I suppose, how this is operationalized in practice, how users experience it, and what, if anything, developers can and should do to at least move in the direction of what we might call cultural alignment?
Yeah, so I think fundamentally when we talk about the question of levers within the whole AI development lifecycle process, it really is a question of, we have all of these human experts, human insights, how or where throughout the life cycle can we insert our own insights and expertise so that it can meaningfully affect the output of the AI. So, I think all of us know the whole AI lifecycle process starts from data collection, then you have the model architecture, you have training, refinement, then after you have like prompting, inference, output, safeguards. All of these currently are very much engineering-driven processes. But I think we've seen yesterday in Stephen Bird's lecture, he has shown that if you involve like local experts or cultural experts, the entire process can definitely change. You just take, for example, data collection. Instead of scraping, maybe we can ask anthropologists or linguists, how might you collect cultural data for cultural alignment? And instead of the internet, maybe you can ask, what about asking the local communities what counts as meaningful cultural data for you and your culture? And just one example of how that can completely change the way that we do things. I think another example that we have done at AI Singapore, our project, is we're looking at reinforcement learning with human feedback. So an example of what we are doing currently is instead of taking or optimizing for friendliness, might we think about some specific attributes of culture and what putting or optimizing for that attribute of culture might mean so that it can meaningfully align outputs. I think also the same issue we see in terms of benchmarks as well. Because I think yesterday from the Professor Stuart Russell's presentation, he asked that perhaps you can take a more scientific approach to AI. So I think one example of taking a scientific approach is because culture, to take Chunhua's point, it exists at multiple levels of abstraction, right? From the nations, culture belongs to nations, but I think we also can see culture in things like different professions or different organizations. Each have our own culture, our own understanding, our own definitions of what counts as truth. And I think if we were to incorporate those epistemologies into the way that we evaluate the models, might we see, for example, that maybe benchmarks might not be the right way of evaluating the model, might perhaps we take a more qualitative approach. So I think throughout fundamentally all of these processes, the question is if you involve human experts, local communities, you might realize that the way that we frame the question might shift. And when you do that, all the engineering processes down the line would naturally shift as well, and that would eventually inform the outputs, change the outcomes, and hopefully make outputs more culturally aligned.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sympathetic, but also concerned that the computer scientists in the room are saying that's all going to take way too long. And I'm reminded actually of an experience years ago in a development context where the World Bank had come into a country that had gone through a crisis and had this whole lecture about how this is going to be locally owned and we need you to sort of tell us your needs. And after 10 minutes of telling you, okay, fine, but here's what we're going to do, and rolled out the development plan that was preordained. So, I mean, Liam, maybe I can bring you in on this point. What do you think are the possibilities and limitations of expecting or hoping for cultural alignment, given your own work on the relationship between languages and how LLMs are kind of representing at least a version? And in particular, I really enjoyed yesterday, so Stephen had this idea of inscription versus transcription, and the computer science approach is you just gather all the data and then just run that, as opposed to looking for some more abstract or contextual version of meaning.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I thought I'd compare and contrast a little bit how we humans learn about and conceptualize language and how LLMs do it, which has impacts on what we can expect from LLMs, I believe. So human language, on its very lowest form, it's sound waves, right? We just produce sound, which we can all then interpret in a meaningful way. Of course, that's not all. There's a lot of structure to language. We have recurring phonemes, we have morphemes, we have words, we have grammatical rules, which we all agree on and obey by, and that's why we can mutually understand one another. And that's the basic rule book of language. And then on top of that, we have semantics or meaning, so the different words and even the different morphemes and little pieces of words we use. They have a certain meaning behind it, and we can put these meanings together into whole sentences and paragraphs and books or speeches and convey complex meanings, arbitrarily complex meanings. So one purpose of language is to reflect the content of the world, talk about the content of the world, but people have also argued that using language is actually action. So that's the pragmatic point. Whenever we speak, we have a goal, we want to achieve something. Maybe my goal here is to convince you of my views or to learn about my fellow panelists' views and discuss with them productively. So whenever we speak, we want to make a small modification to the world, a change to the world. And I think this is which links very closely to culture as well, because the way we do this, what is accepted, what is not accepted, varies across communities. And as others have pointed out, we learn about this throughout our life. And while being situated in the world, where we have lots and lots of different inputs, we can see, we interact with other people, we can interpret other people's mimics, we have feelings, we have emotions, we can feel pain, we can feel reward and disreward. And that's extremely important to puzzle it all together, and that's where language stands as one part in this whole universe of different signals and interactions. And as we learned from Stephen yesterday, most of the language is spoken, and that particularly applies to oral cultures, of course, but that even applies to English. Only a tiny little fraction of the language we produce every day is written down, and an even tinier fraction makes it into the web and being scrapable by the big companies and feedable into the LLM. So what the LLM does, on the other hand, is getting exposed to this still enormous corpus of written data, and LLMs are very vast, and in their vast parameter space, they're extremely good at extracting patterns from this data, abstracting away to a certain extent, and being able to puzzle together the different pieces so that they can produce language that sounds very plausible and understand, consider reasonable large contexts as well. In addition to that, they're being trained with human feedback. So we have these additional rules through which we try to teach them to be safe or to align with humans in some way. But that, in the end, this just changes the associations within the parameter space. So I guess the main point is that LLMs do not have a world model, do not have any external signal other than the words and the patterns from the text data that they achieve, with the caveat perhaps that there is definitely some multimodal work, as Chunhua was pointing out, where language and vision is trying to be combined. But this fundamental world model and model of reward and social interaction and so forth is completely missing. And I think this raises two questions. So one is, how much culture do we actually expect such models to ingest based on what they can experience, what they can get as input and what they cannot get as input? And then, of course, the other question, which has been raised in this context many times, is still for some languages, some cultures, there is a lot of input, whereas for others there is not. But even for the high resource languages, I think there is a question of where's the limit and what can we expect LLMs to do, and where should we just expect that maybe AI is not intelligence in the human way, and there is a gap and a limit to what we should expect.
Yeah, and just on the limits of data, I mean, I think many people also would be familiar with the idea of model poisoning, that if you run out of data, there was an initial view, well, maybe we can create more synthetic data and the AI will train itself, but that leads to potentially model collapse. There's been some subsequent research, but not the topic of this panel. So maybe let me come back to this interdisciplinary question, or the question of the challenge between methodologies. And maybe Eric and Chunhua, can I ask you both to reflect, maybe Eric first, coming from the kind of anthropologist, social scientist side, on engaging with the computer scientists, as you have through AI Singapore and elsewhere. And Chunhua, you mentioned you enjoy talking with the sort of non-STEM people, so from your perspective, what you see as the barriers to meaningful, like what are the sticking points, both methodological, cultural, I suppose, even within the disciplines, the challenges of working together? Maybe Eric and then Chunhua.
I think it's a good question. I think it gets at the core of the sort of trying to really operationalize this in a practical sense, because I think, as Hakim pointed out, and I think many people have been talking about this, that this is not a question that can be, that we should expect can be solved by sort of one group of scientists or one disciplines or whatever. It's kind of it necessitates a sort of interdisciplinary interaction. And I think one of the biggest gaps, I think, especially in much AI practice in the present, is that there is this, without sounding too judgmental, I would call it that there's a lack of intentionality in this. There's this kind of idea that data, we just scrape all of this stuff from the internet, we basically pour it into a model as if it's coal that goes into a steam engine, that powers the thing, and at the end of it, eventually some cultural thing will plop out, right? which I think that's sort of the problem, going back to my original point about this sort of, and I think you raised it as well, about we tend to frame the approach here around sort of nations or kind of country level or whatever. But even then, it's like I would love anybody to tell me, like, what's an Australian, right? Between macro all the way down, right? And like in my case, I'm a Swede myself, but I'm also sort of like the child of immigrant parents, but I'm also from a particular region of Sweden that has a strong regional identity. And like, I think there is a tendency to view these things as like kind of tick box categories that sort of narrow things down. And like, fine, on a granular level, that is sort of to some extent true, but they're also not mutually exclusive. They kind of don't cut anything off. They rather overlap because at the same time as I have this, strong regional identity and so on and so on, I'm still a Swede in the way that somebody from, 1,500 kilometers up north is, right? And I mean, and we do Swedishness in very different ways, and between individuals we might disagree on things and so on, right? So there's this sort of like scalability thing here. There's this like constant sliding scale of interactions, right? And I know in some of my writing, especially together with Hakim, I've described this as the sort of the fractal nature of culture, where you have these grand patterns that you can see in this sort of proverbial cultural image, and as you zoom in, you don't remove complexity. You're just sort of like, the pattern changes slightly, but it still remains just as complex as anything else, right? So in order to, I think, really work with this, you need this tendency of, or you need this drive for intentionality. You need to decide, what am I aligning this after more specifically? Kind of Swedish culture or Australian culture or whatever, it's just not good enough. I mean, you could, but then at the same time, you need to sort of be aware of the fact that that is a snapshot of an image abstracted at a particular level, and that won't necessarily apply to sort of very granular interactions, or it might sort of completely freeze certain people out, minority groups, for example, as we heard yesterday from Stephen, right? So, and I think the challenge here is that from the social sciences, we are, especially in anthropology, I think, but also many others, we tend to be very well aware of this. This is like a core part of our training, especially when we do ethnography, that like, I was told off about this a lot when I was doing my initial training, that like, I can't write about, oh, this is what Swedes do, because it's kind of like, yeah, but there's also 11 million. You can't sort of generalize in that sense, right? And this is a thing that's very clearly hammered in, that we speak and we work in specific cultural contexts. You mentioned before how I stalked transhumanists for about 18 months, and that's sort of like true, and everything I basically write about is within that very particular context. And in my experience working and engaging with more of the engineering side, it's almost like it's on the flip side, where the sort of generalizability is the driving point here. It's like, just scrape enough data, chuck it in there, and the model will find the patterns. But there's no kind of intentionality from the research perspective, and I think I think that's a huge methodological miss that's really going to make sort of what we can call meaningful or more accurate or whatever cultural alignment. It's kind of like a shot in the dark, and you hope that the model will find the right connections, which I think is a bit of a, at the very least, inefficient way of trying to do it.
But I mean, this is part of the problem of AI more generally. I mean, for the last couple of days, we've been saying we have no idea exactly where it's all going.
Exactly.
But Chunhua, bringing it back down to the disciplinary question, which might be solvable, can you talk about your perspective on working with people from the other side of, not the aisle, but other disciplines?
Sorry. Actually, kind of echoing the challenge here. So it's hard for us to interpret what does culture mean to people. It's also hard to interpret what does culture mean inside the model, actually. So give a question like, do you believe in God? If you give it in Chinese or if you give it in Mandarin, the answer might be different. But what caused the difference inside the model? How is the model doing those kind of cultural reasoning? And which part are they using? So that's also kind of very challenging, actually, to draw. And yeah, we do have like interpretability in computer science in NLP that are evolving, that allow us to isolate certain parts of the model and to do kind of contrastive comparison to see which part is possibly cause the output of the model. So yeah, we are like with like people here, we are exploring in that direction, but still like ongoing. Yeah, so that's one challenge. And another challenge I keep encountering is about the separation of language and culture.
Yeah, that's the
like Leah said, within a culture, within a language, we have the morphology side and we have the sound, which has in. So I was doing some testing of language models, cultural taboo, so in Chinese. So I gave the model question like, for example, my Chinese granddad is having a 70 years birthday celebration, and I want to buy him a clock as a birthday present. Should I pick a red color? Red symbolizes good luck. So I gave the question to 8 language models. And 6 of them responded, yes, you should give a red clock. But 2 of them cautious that clock in Mandarin means Zhuang, which shares similar days, like as death. So it's not appropriate. So I think my point here is like, it's how can we evaluate this in a proper way? And for model to be culturally aligned, they should both know what's appropriate and also what's not appropriate, and yeah.
Yeah. So, Zhuang, can I bring you on this? Like, so one interesting question here is what's the aim, but then there's also how you would do it. And one thing that Chunhua brings up is this idea that is reasonably common, and Hakim, I might ask you to look at this as well, is that you basically play whack-a-mole. The model does something bad, and you say, don't do that.
Yeah.
And then if there's something else bad, you say, don't do that. An alternative approach is you retrain the entire model. That's very expensive and might not lead to the output anyway, because you don't know how it's doing things. So do you think about cultural alignment, and then Hakim, maybe you can talk about some of the red teaming, where it's not the way in which well, maybe it is partly the way you develop your own cultural sensitivities by making mistakes and then being gently corrected. How do you train the models in practice, and what is this role of correction versus training?
That's a good question. Actually, now we just, for the safety alignment, we just define several rules. The number is limited, only at most a few hundred. But actually, for cultural alignment, I've been trying to build in a cultural norm bank that includes maybe several thousand or even more cultural norms. But then it comes actually a problem that remains unsolved for me. Whether I should come to fine-grained social norms, because social norms are just the rules, or we could use semi-automatic method. For example, someone just scrape all the Wikipedia and just extract the rules from Wikipedia using another large language model. But at least it's grounded with some factuality or fact knowledge from Wikipedia. And of course, we could make it semi-automatic, but still is limited. Whether we could enumerate all the social norms in the world, and we could use those social norms to regulate the large language models, still remain unsolved for me. Actually, I'm curious for whether you have social scientists that have such solutions or answers. Maybe when I have to iterate all the social norms, it maybe includes several millions of rules, right, or even more. But I'm not sure whether we could iterate all the rules. But for now, I just constructed a very small set of normal banks that includes 4,000 social norms. But still, I think that might not be enough to regulate the larger models given different cultural contexts, because there are too many variants for the cultural context.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to go back to the point that cultural norms are very hard to write down, but I mean, you can say the same about language. And dictionaries have a really interesting history of whether you aspire to a fixed meaning or a dynamic meaning. I think most cultures would say language is going to be dynamic, which is why they change over time.
Yeah. Also, that's another topic we are working on, that we're trying to build dynamic norm bank, that we could dynamically add new rules and to use continual learning method to regulate the larger models. But still, I think the fundamental problem, that's also another bottleneck actually, because the rules always change, the social norms always change over time.
And that's why, so part of my work has been looking at the role of lawyers, and that's why I think lawyers, at least some lawyers, will still have jobs. It's changing. Hakim, talk about the red teaming and what the aim is in red teaming and what's possible.
In talking about whack-a-mole, of course, when you red team, you will surface some, in most cases, very specific instances where the model allegedly failed, right? In my case, I did a lot of rate teaming in terms of trying to talk about safety or talking about like racist or toxic language. The idea is once you achieve some specific exploit, do you have a general insight about that specific exploit, right? Then you can abstract 1 or 2 levels upwards. From there, those insights, you pass it along to the technical team who can then decide the specific intervention point. So, for example, I think if it's something very specific, I'm trying to think of an example. When I was doing rate teaming for safety, one topic that I prompted was, okay, if I were to, okay, this might be a bit sensitive. So the topic is about suicide and about explosive and all that. The abstract point I get from that is, if I did not reveal my intentions to the model, then the model will fail in providing safe outputs. So that was the general insight from the more specific prompts that I provide. So once you have that kind of like general insight, right, then perhaps you can again give to the technical team. So one example, if it's something that is solvable at a very specific level, prompt injection might be the way to go. You might just like, you know, in one of the levels, right, one of the prompts, you can say, okay, be more aware of the intentions of the user. But if something more general, you will have definitely, you need to do more like a fine-tuning kind of method where you then collect data surrounding it. What's important here is what I personally call exploding the conceptual tree. So you have the thing, right, be more aware of the user intention, right, then you got to explode all the possible ways that this could happen. I know it's probably very hard, but it's something that you need to do, because for my own research, what I found out was that testing the specific does not mean that you test the abstract in large language model, and it works both ways. Testing the abstract doesn't mean that you test the specific. You gotta test both levels, both the abstract and the specific, you gotta test them. What I mean by testing, of course, you just like prompt at the abstract level and prompt at the specific levels to see whether they give you toxic or non-toxic responses. So I think fundamentally the point is that when you do rate teaming, the idea is that you get the specific exploits, but whether there's a broader point to take away from it. And then from the technical perspective, you got to identify the right way in which you intervene so that you can have like a more meaningful like alignment at the end.
Yeah, so I mean, this raises the huge question, which is whether this will change as we seem to be moving into world models away from language. Because a number of you have commented on the fact that these models are language models at the moment. They've only got the written text. At the moment, that's changing. And that's only a fraction, I think you point out, it's a fraction of human experience. So I suppose, one, will that change? In the short term, the problem is that lawyers have got involved. So actually there was a story, I think today or maybe yesterday's New York Times, that one of the lawsuits against OpenAI over a 16-year-old who committed suicide, the OpenAI lawyers are saying, but he violated the terms and conditions, because we've got these terms and conditions that no one reads, that says it's you can't use this model to engage in self-harm. Therefore, it's his fault, which I think most of us would agree is a pretty terrible argument, even if legally it probably makes a bit of sense.
Definitely makes no sense, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Okay, my moral conscience on the good is reminding me. So Leah, I've got one more question for Leah about what good might look like in this space, what we might be realistically aiming for, and then I'm going to open it up. So Leah, yeah, what do you think we could realistically hope for in this space? I said in the framing that a couple of possible alternatives. There's this idea that some people have of a universal language model. I think many of us through science fiction were familiar with the idea that there'd just be, everyone would communicate, you might have some sort of interpretation device, and that there'd be one big culture. I think there are real reasons to be concerned about that. But if you have a kind of federated model, then maybe some cultures operate at different speeds, meaning some get much more value out of this. So yeah, what do you think good might look like?
Very good question. I think there's definitely a trade-off between generality, Gen AI, and the ability to cater for all the different cultures and all the different use cases. I think we are still looking at Gen AI a bit as a piece of magic and just hoping for the best and hoping to just write down our rules as we've heard before and thinking, well, maybe it will work out. I don't think it will work out. And I think intentionality, which has come up before, is the key. And the only realistic way forward I see is to think about the use case and the goal, which also, to a point, addresses the problem of defining what culture is. If you have a specific task that you want your LLM to do, within that task, it suddenly becomes a lot more feasible to think about culturally appropriate answers. Perhaps you also have a bunch of cultures to which this task is relevant to, and you don't need to make it universally fair. You only have users from certain cultures. So for these highly sensitive tasks for which we really care about cultural appropriateness, I think it makes sense to focus our attention there and work with the social scientists and the experts and community members from the relevant cultures to really work it out in those tasks. And for the more Gen AI general use case, I think one important part of the picture is education and expectation management and telling people that they should not expect in every case and in every scenario for these models to be culturally appropriate, and not harping too much on the term of intelligence in general might help with that sort of expectation management too, I think. But of course, the inequity between high resource and low resource will remain with that for sure. And
yeah, and I think you're touching on questions of anthropomorphism and the fact that we attribute agency, intentionality to these devices, but at the same time not attributing the failures that we expect in humans, because we have this mix of both attributing human-like qualities, but we also have automation bias that we're also very likely to follow these models. Okay, this is fascinating. We could keep chatting, but I really want to bring in